Atlantis has a blueprint, an actual set of dimensions and material specs written by Plato himself. He wrote it down 2,000 years ago, and for most of that history, nobody really tried to dissect it. I mean, people searched for it, they drew maps, started religions over it, but nobody really sat down with the numbers and tried to figure it out. Could this actually work? Until now. We tried to take Plato's specifications seriously, and something was weird. This is the Atlantis you know. 3 concentric rings of land and water. Every documentary, every thumbnail, every AI reconstruction, it's always this view from above. But there's something architects do when we want to understand how a building actually works. We cut it into a section. And when you look at it from the side, you realize the way that we understand Atlantis is actually completely wrong. So let's start with the plan. This is the most common representation of Atlantis: 3 concentric circles of water and land. The central island is 5 stadia across, about the size of Midtown Manhattan. There's a temple in the center, surrounded by the palace complex. Then every ring outwards gets wider. 1 stadia, 2 stadia, 3 stadia. Each of the walls are clad in a different metal, and then another wall, about 9 kilometers from the center, which contains the outer city. So from here, the canal is just a thin blue line. But according to Plato, it's actually 3 plethora wide and 1 plethron deep, and it stretches 50 stadia to the ocean. So in section, it's a trench deeper than a 10-story building, cut through a flat coastal plain at sea level, stretching for about 6 miles. That's roughly 22 million cubic meters of earth just for the canal. Then there's the 3 water rings, also cut 1 plethron deep. So that's another 280 million cubic meters. So in total, over 300 million cubic meters of excavation. Just for reference, the Panama Canal, one of the biggest engineering projects in human history, moved about 205 million cubic meters. And it used industrial dynamite, steam shovels, and it took 10 years. And about 25,000 workers died trying to build it. Plato's water system is 1.5 Panama canals, and that's just the canal to the sea. To connect these rings, they built bridges over the water and opened out a channel through the zones of land and roofed this over, making a subterranean passage sufficient for a single vessel. And a vessel, or a standard ancient Mediterranean trireme for that time, was roughly 37 meters long and 6 meters wide, with the body of the ship sitting around 2 meters above the waterline. The mast was around 9 meters, but that could be lowered for passing through the tunnels or bridges. So that gives you a minimum opening size of 7 by 9, excavated across all of the land rings. It's roughly 185 meters for the first tunnel and 370 meters for the second one. Now imagine excavating all of this at water level with 30 meters of ocean pressing on both sides. Not an easy task, but that's not even it, because most depictions of Atlantis leave this part out. Plato actually describes a second canal. It collects water from the mountains and the rivers, and it wraps around this massive agricultural field, about 3,000 by 2,000 stadia. It's roughly the size of Colorado. And it gets fed into this grid of smaller channels. And it creates this massive irrigation system. Then it connects back to the outer canals and eventually drains it out to the sea. As you can see, the sheer scale of the system is massive. But actually, the scale isn't even the biggest problem. It's the water. Plato describes not 2, but 3 separate water systems running through the city. There's the 2 canals that we discussed, but then there's the 3rd one on the central island. There are natural hot springs of hot and cold fresh water. The Atlanteans built cisterns around them, some open air, some covered for winter bathing, and the overflow gets carried outward through aqueducts to the rest of the city. So you got salt water flowing inward from the sea, irrigation water flowing from the plain, and then fresh water flowing outward from the center. 3 systems moving in 3 different directions through the same city. In plan, it looks elegant, but in section, you start to see the problem. See, coastal freshwater, it works like this. Fresh groundwater is lighter than salt water, so it floats on top of it in what's called a freshwater lens. Basically, it's a bubble of drinkable water sitting above the denser salt water below. But the balance is very fragile. There's this thing called the Haben-Hertzberg principle. And it basically says for every meter of fresh water above sea level, there's about 40 meters of fresh water below it. But the problem happens when you start pumping, because every meter you lower that water table, you lose about 40 meters of drinkable water underneath. Now, imagine surrounding that lens with 3 concentric rings of ocean water, each one 30 meters deep. Salt water is heavier, so it pushes inward from all directions. And every time the Atlanteans draw from those springs, for baths or cisterns, or from the Grove of Poseidon, they lower that water table just a little bit more, and salt water rises to fill the gaps. And eventually, the springs aren't fresh anymore. This is actually the #1 reason infrastructure fails in coastal cities today. For example, Cape May County in New Jersey has had to abandon over 100 wells because they just pump too much groundwater. Pacific Island nations deal with this all the time. But Atlantis essentially built 3 artificial coastlines concentrically around its only freshwater source. But alright, let's set the water aside for now. When we start looking at other circular cities, real and fictional, there's something about the shape that makes it fail. By the way, this is our 2nd video on Atlantis, and in this video, we really wanted to dissect the Atlantis model in a section, and we wanted to show all of this in our webpage, which we built using Framer, which is also the sponsor of today's video. Framer is a web builder that lets you iterate with precision and turn your design ideas into a live website with a single click. I think Atlantis, it has a very distinct visual language. Although it's gone through many different evolutions across different eras, we really wanted to tie it together with this abstraction of the ocean. Typically, to create a moving background like this, you would have to upload a video animation. But by using the new shader feature, you can control the movement or color or gradients or the scale straight in Framer. The gradients even have a seed property you can scrub for endless variations, and they're always updating the library, so there's a growing number of templates. And this is what it looks like. And now you just click create web page, and that's it. It's live. You can see very easily how it can adapt across different devices, and our whole team can build on the same project together in real time. And here's the new part. This time, we didn't build it all by hand. Framer Agent works right on the live site. We describe a change, and the agent would restructure a section, fix the mobile layout, and even publish. No code, no handoff. It brings the speed, and we keep control of the details. You can find our research page linked in the description, along with a Framer link with a discount code if you guys want to check it out. This is Palma Nova. It was built for total defensive coverage, but it was dropped in a field with no port, no trade route, and no economic reason for it to exist. The Republic has to start pardoning criminals just to fill the city. Paradise Island from Attack on Titan, the last of humanity, lives inside 3 concentric walls. The king sits at the center, and the poorest, they live at the outer gates. The geometry basically decides who gets eaten first. The city of Firuzabad, which was a perfect circle in the middle of Iran. It was 2 kilometers across, built in 224 AD by a king who had just claimed power and needed a new capital to prove it. He calls it Ardashir Wara, the glory of Ardashir. 20 radial avenues, concentric walls, and a fire temple at the center. The entire city is designed as a miniature Zoroastrian cosmos. But his son, as soon as he was in charge, he moved the capital, because you can't expand a circle. So the failure mode, it's always the same. Hierarchy gets embedded into the geometry. Growth hits a hard limit. And the thing that makes it defensible is the same thing that makes it rigid. Because these cities aren't shaped by the environment. They're diagrams dropped onto a site, completely ignoring the rivers or the coastlines or the topography. Instead of following the geography, they follow an idea. 5 centuries later, when the caliph of a brand new empire conquers the same region and decides to build a new capital, he draws the exact same shape. This is the round city of Baghdad, built from scratch in 762 AD by Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. Unlike Palmanova, this one had a very good reason to exist: trade. It was a perfect circle, roughly 2 kilometers across, with triple walls and a moat. The palace and the Great Mosque were at the center, and markets and workshops filled the rings between the walls, connected by radial streets. There were 4 gates aligned to the major trade routes, stretching from China to the Mediterranean. And those markets turned Baghdad into one of the richest cities in the world. But in just 11 years, al-Mansur kicks the merchants outside the walls. The story is that a visiting ambassador warned him that enemies could enter the city pretending to be shoppers. And once the merchants were outside, the population followed. So Baghdad kept growing, but just outside the walls. Now, here's the weird part. Baghdad is one of the most well-documented cities in history. We have coins and scientific instruments and physical artifacts that can tell us pretty closely what it was like to live in ancient Baghdad. But we've never found any archaeological trace of the round city itself. No remnants of circular walls or foundations. Nothing. So where did it all go? The obvious explanation is the material. The walls were built with sun-baked mud brick, which does need constant upkeep. But mud brick structures from the same period have survived from all over Iraq and other parts of the world. The ziggurats of Ur, the towers of Shiban, and yes, it is true that modern Baghdad was built directly on top of this, and between wars and political instability, nobody's been really able to excavate properly. But still, a structure that's 24 meters high and 44 meters thick should leave something. Foundations that size leave traces at every comparable site in Mesopotamia. So where are they? Well, when you start looking, you start to realize something very interesting. The most detailed descriptions of the round city was written around 891. That's 130 years after the city was founded. And the source that's the most architecturally specific was written in the 11th century, over 300 years after the founding, when the round city had already been swallowed by Baghdad's sprawl. In fact, every detailed account of the round city was written by someone who never really saw it at its peak. So, is it possible that the round city, as we imagine it, never quite existed? That the most famous circular city in history, or the second most famous, was partly a reconstruction of writers from a time when this golden age was slipping away from them. Not fabricated, but refined, idealized, a perfect geometry imposed on a messier reality by people who needed to believe that their civilization had built something perfect, which, if you think about it, is exactly what we do with Atlantis. So, Atlantis. Is it a myth? Or was it real? It actually comes down to a pretty simple question. Was Plato being literal or metaphorical? If you look at his other works, in no other book does he describe a place in this kind of obsessive physical detail. They're about justice and love and truth. Beautiful language, but 0 dimensions. And then he sits down and writes Atlantis, and writes a spec sheet, pretty much. So why would a philosopher, someone who spent his entire career arguing that physical reality is a distraction from truth, suddenly switch to architectural specifications? Well, Plato had a theory. Perfect ideas can only exist as ideas. The moment you try to make them real, they break. A perfect person, a perfect shape, a perfect city. Because reality always introduces compromise. So this physical world can only ever be an imperfect copy of the idea. And he called this the theory of forms. This was actually one of the first things that we learned in architecture school, and it's just starting to make sense now. As a society, it is very easy for us to get enticed by the idea or the image, and architects are actually great at selling these ideas. And a lot of times we build these beautiful ideas, but we forget that reality is actually pretty messy. So instead of designing for flexibility and growth, we build these rigid containers. That's beautiful to look at, but when you start to break them down, they crack. So I actually wonder if Plato designed a city that couldn't work on purpose. And the fact that we keep chasing it is the ultimate proof of his theory. Because this idea of a perfect civilization, it's just so much better than the reality. So what do you guys think? Was Plato being literal or metaphorical? Let me know in the comments. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!